Hey guys, I wanted to put together a quick video going over a couple of graphics that I've seen pop up over this past week. And I want to start with, on the night that we had the New Hampshire primary, we saw a lot of this in the mainstream media where they would combine Buttigieg, Klobuchar, and Biden's numbers together and show that it was significantly higher than Sanders, and that if the centrists can coalesce behind one candidate, then they should be able to get past Bernie, who right now is the frontrunner, of course, winning the popular vote in the first two states of Iowa and New Hampshire, and taking the lead in the average of the national polls and looking pretty strong to potentially go on and win the next contest upcoming in the Nevada caucus. So Sanders is in a very strong position right now, and there's a lot of jockeying for position behind Bernie. So we can see here the total that Buttigieg, Klobuchar, and Biden had in New Hampshire was at 53% compared to Sanders, who had the most in terms of the plurality of the vote at 26%, just eking past Pete Buttigieg. So the conventional wisdom here is Buttigieg, Klobuchar, and Biden are occupying that moderate centrist type lane. So if they can figure things out and coalesce behind one centrist option, then they should be able to go on and defeat Bernie Sanders. But this is a very rudimentary way of thinking about politics, and this is not how things end up happening, because if you take a look at the second choice among these individuals, it's not so cut and dry. Because, for instance, you take a look at Biden voters, their second choice is Bernie Sanders more than any other option. So if Biden stepped out of the race, it would more likely net benefit Sanders than it would Buttigieg and Klobuchar. Now, you could say that if the centrists start bowing out and that particular candidate gets the endorsements from the ones that are bowing out of the race, then that could potentially be a difference maker. But even then, politics just isn't that type of game where 100% of an individual support will coalesce behind a different candidate. Perhaps voters that put a lot of effort into researching the policy and issues that these different candidates are supporting, those are the ones that are more likely to coalesce behind a candidate that's in a particular lane. But there's also a lot of very low information voters who don't necessarily dig into it all that deep. They end up voting for somebody who they like the speeches that they give, or perhaps it's just somebody who they recognize their name. And that's potentially, for instance, here what we have with Joe Biden, where the most popular second choice among his voters go to Bernie Sanders, even though ideologically they're pretty different. These are two candidates that have the most name recognition. They've been around politics for a very long time. They've gained the trust of a lot of Democratic voters. So if Biden were to bow out of the race, it doesn't necessarily mean that his voters would go over to Klobuchar, Buttigieg, or Bloomberg. There's a decent chance that they could end up going to Bernie Sanders. And we actually see this in another graphic that we had out this week. This is a poll taken from YouGov, and it shows head-to-head matchups between Bernie Sanders and all of these upper-tier Democratic hopefuls. And they did this in a matchup with every single candidate, and Sanders was the only one that had the lead against every other potential option in that head-to-head race. So we can see here that Sanders was ahead by Joe Biden by 4 percentage points, ahead of Warren by 2 percentage points, and that was the closest head-to-head matchup that we had. And then the other centrist, Sanders significantly ahead of Bloomberg by 15%, ahead of Pete Buttigieg by 17%, and ahead of Amy Klobuchar by 21 percentage points. So again, like I was saying, if these centrists bow out of the race and hope that their supporters coalesce behind another centrist option, it just doesn't appear like that would be the eventual case, at least in terms of what we're seeing in these head-to-head matchup numbers. The races are much more dynamic than what the pundits on the mainstream media might have you believe, and it is just pretty ridiculous. The comparisons that we were getting here from 2020 in that New Hampshire primary compared to 2016, where Sanders just had a 1-to-1 matchup against Hillary Clinton, where this time around he's going against 9 other potential candidates that could pull in some votes. So even though, yes, he did get significantly less of the vote, he was going against a much more diverse field. So this is going to likely continue to be a very fluid situation where, as we continue to work our way through primary season and these candidates who aren't doing so well bow out of the race because they can't continue for either funding purposes or they just don't want the embarrassment that goes along with staying in the race a bit longer than your chances would entail you to have a possibility to go on and win that nomination, it's very likely that the supporters of these respective individuals are going to be split up a number of different ways, and it's not even necessarily the most predictable in how that support will be split up among the rest of the candidates. But things are looking very positive for Bernie Sanders. He's got a ton of momentum. He's been surging in the polls. He's got the grassroots support, the fundraising, and with the Nevada caucus coming up just around the corner, it's potentially another very strong situation for Sanders if he goes on and wins that one, and by a decent margin. That would only help his chances continuing to move on to the next state of South Carolina, which is likely to be a bit more competitive there at the top, along with Joe Biden. So we'll see how this race plays out in the coming weeks. Should be really interesting to see how this dynamic shapes up with the candidates and how long they end up staying in the race or bowing out and when they decide to make those decisions. So I appreciate you guys stopping by. Consider subscribing to the YouTube channel, and I'll see you back here for future videos.